Bill, I'm very happy that you shared with us your observations and how you saw the relationship between these two giants. I'm really glad that I've met a man who has seen everything with his own eyes, and I've heard everything. And I think that that is important, because a lot of people talk about these things while being ignorant, by reading a book, by not even understanding the content of the book they're reading. They're just simply quoting certain phrases. But I'm very glad I heard that from you. I think I have to also ask you, what do you think is the central core message that is coming out of the dialogues of these two giants, of these two gentlemen that sit down and for years and years they explored what? And why is that important now to the current world crisis that we have in here?
I think you just used the word, the current world crisis. Both of these gentlemen agreed that the crisis in the world is not generated from out there, it's generated from in here. The crisis to quote Krishnamurti, the crisis is in consciousness. Our consciousness has usurped, how can I say, it's become its own totality, if you will. That there's nothing more than that, than the process of thought, which is what generates, what makes consciousness, consciousness being the content of thought. And that's what the world is all about. And in fact, there's a gentleman who I went to high school with who was a Nobel laureate in physics, a man named Steven Weinberg, that David mentions in one of the dialogues. And he mentions the fact that Steven said that the deeper we go into science, the more meaningless the whole thing becomes. Well, David felt quite the opposite, that the meaninglessness is a result of our inability to understand how powerful the nature of thought has become in defining who we are as a human species, if you will. That's the problem.
So their focus on consciousness and on the crisis in consciousness.
On that, and that being generated by the process of thought, the process of thinking. And when you say that to someone, most people will say, well, what else is there? Well, as far as we know, there is only that. But what people don't realize is that thought, the thinking process, is generated, as they explain. We don't create our thoughts create us. Our thoughts are generated from memory, from the input our senses have of what takes place in our lives, our DNA. It's all stored in memory. And then we access memory to remember our names, our IDs, our furniture. It's all, memory is telling us who we are, and is creating, in a sense, a self-image, an image of ourselves based on the past. And we in turn perceive life through that image. This in fact has been mentioned before. St. Paul himself in Corinthians mentions the fact that it is as if we see life through a glass darkly. Ingmar Bergman did a famous movie called Through a Glass Darkly. So the self-image, whatever we see, the way we see the world is filtered through the self-image, which is a product of thought. And so we're perceiving life through thought. It's being filtered literally through the thinking process.
Yes. Bill, why would a physicist be interested in all this?
Well, that's the beauty of the series of dialogues that took place. I think that although the publishers said that they would have liked a physicist to write the biography, which made sense because he was a world-famous physicist, he was a human being before he was a physicist. And from the time he was a child, and I have him in one of our transatlantic conversations, which I've recorded, which I will allow you to hear one of these days, David explains to me that from the time he was a little boy, there was this quest, if you will. I interpret it, and in fact on the audio tape I mentioned, to me it was a spiritual quest. And it began with religion. And it wasn't working for him. Now this was in the 20s and 30s. And at the time the world was in great unrest. So he moved to politics and became enamored, if you will, of dialectical materialism, as many intellects had at the time. But then he moved on again, because that wasn't working. And that's when physics happened in his life. And in fact, I think that dialectical materialism happened as a result of his going to Berkeley when he was working with Oppenheimer, and all of the other scientists felt the same way, which eventually led to all of them being investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and David Bohm refusing to talk about his other friends, and he was castigated for it and had to leave the country and never regained his citizenship again. It was a terrible, terrible time in our lives. So it was a movement constantly, a constant movement in a spiritual quest. When he met Krishnamurti, when these dialogues began, they found a way of talking about what is, if you will, or at least pointing to it, and showing that there perhaps is a way out of the dilemma that mankind finds itself as a result of its inability to function using all that life has given it at this point. I showed you a book today called Man's Presumptuous Brain. It's become the be-all and end-all. When I was working with my friend that I mentioned to you, Paul Bakirita, there was a man who wrote a bestseller. He came and visited us to see the work that Paul was doing, and he wrote a book. The first chapter was about Paul, but the name of the book was the Brain That Changes Itself. Now, the brain doesn't change itself. The self changes its brain. The brain is a piece of meat. It's an extraordinary piece of meat that has developed through evolution from the reptilian brain to the mammalian brain to the neocortex. But our inability, perhaps, for all of these three brains, all of which still exist, to function properly has caused the crisis that's out there.